Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin daf nun hey. This is the daf for Shmini Atzeret, Shabbat. We are going to do a quick review before we start from the top of our daf of the machloket Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda about hekdesh. So if somebody has hekdesh, something sanctified, and then they use it for some non-sacred purpose, there's a big debate between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda what actually happens to that money, and does it, or whatever item they used, does the Kedusha, is the sanctity removed from it, or does it stay? And they each have a different opinion, whether it happened b'shogeg, accidentally, or they didn't realize it was hekdesh, or intentionally. So let's start with Rabbi Yehuda. That's the mainstream opinion of how we understand Me'ila. Me'ila is misuse of consecrated property. And it's not just really misuse, but what we learn from the sugya is you're liable because you turned something from something that was sanctified into something that's no longer sanctified. And then you desecrated the item by doing that, and therefore you're liable. So Rabbi Yehuda says, the Torah says you're only liable in a shkaga case, if it was unwitting, if it was accidental, you didn't know, but not if it was intentional. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, if you did it intentionally, the sanctity remains. If you do it unwittingly, shkaga, then the sanctity is removed. And the whole relevance for our purposes was, what if you betroth a woman with that money? So if it was money that was accidentally used to betroth the woman, you didn't know it was Kiddushin, then basically that works because you turned it into something non-sacred, and therefore you betrothed her with it. It was your money to use. If it was done intentionally, the sanctity was never removed, in which case it was not the man's money to betroth the woman with it, in which case the Kiddushin is not valid. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says it's the opposite. If you unintentionally, you didn't even know, and you betrothed a woman with, or bought an item with this sanctified money, the money doesn't become whole. Okay, even though the Torah says unwitting, yes, Rabbi Meir says the following: if you actually, and this is one of the ways we understood it yesterday, if you actually use the money or use the item, let's say, and ate it, and it was destroyed completely, or whatever you did to it, then you actually turned it into chul. But if you just use money to purchase something, and then you find out, oh, that was sanctified money, you never would have made the sale, and the person never would have wanted to take the money from you because they don't want to deal with sanctified money. So everything reverts back to what it was, meaning it's as if nothing really happened. And only if the item is completely gone or part of it is gone, then you can be liable for Me'ila. But if the item is in existence exactly as it was before, nothing's changed, then basically we say, oh yeah, this was all a big mistake. As we say, mekach ta'ut, and it all goes back. Therefore, if you betroth a woman with money by accident, neither of sides of the couple would have wanted to use sanctified money, and therefore she's not betrothed. However, if you intentionally do it, and you could care less about the halacha, and you say, I want to use this to betroth my wife, or I want to use it to buy a bottle of milk, or whatever it might be, container of milk, then you have actually done something really wrong, and you've turned it into, and it's now become non-sacred. Okay, and then you change its status for sure. And then if you betrothed a woman with it, it would actually be valid because it's no longer sanctified, and you are the owner now. Okay, so it's forbidden to do that, but if you do it intentionally, according to Rabbi Meir, of course you turned it into chul. How much, right? You intended to do this. So now, then the issue is that Me'ila by Torah law is shkaga only, but maybe you're just not liable to bring a korban. Sometimes sacrifices come as a way to provide you with atonement, and maybe we say you're not deserving of atonement in this case. So now we're going to quote a different Mishnah. We're going to start our daf with a Mishnah from Shekalim. And now we're going to try to figure out the Mishnah. What is it talking about, and does it fit in with one of these opinions? Tanan hatam, it says in the Mishnah there, you happen to be wandering outside Jerusalem somewhere between Jerusalem and Migdal Eder, which is somewhere in the Gush Etzion area. And that distance around Jerusalem in all directions, not just in the direction of the Gush, okay? It's actually somewhere maybe toward Beit Lechem, but somewhere in that whole region. That same distance, in any direction there is. And then you find this animal. Now, the assumption is if you find an animal in one of those areas, it likely came from Jerusalem. And if it likely came from Jerusalem, many of the animals that are wandering around Jerusalem are sanctified animals. Okay. And what do I mean by sanctified? They were designated for sacrifices, and maybe the animal just ran away. Okay, so now you have an issue. This animal might be sanctified. Now you find this animal and you want to take this animal into your possession. So what do? So now, or actually, I shouldn't even say that yet. Right now, we don't yet know what the Mishna is talking about. Okay, you find an animal. If it was chulin, okay, if it was a male animal, olot, you can assume it was designated for korban ola because korban ola was brought from male animals only. Nikevot, if it was females, zivchei shlamim. We can assume it was from a peace offering because peace offerings can also be brought from female animals. We're going to have a bit of a problem. Just because it's male doesn't mean it was for an ola, a burnt offering. It could have been a whole bunch of different offerings. We'll see this later. And shlamim could also be male and just be right. And female, there's also other sacrifices. So we're going to have to figure this out. But right now you can make an assumption. If it was male, it was for an ola. If it was female, it was for a shlamim. Ella, now they say, wait a minute. Scharim olotu dahave, zivchei shlamim lo have. But wait. Okay, now we start with the first question, which is similar to what I just said, although not entirely. The first question is, males are olot, but they can't be shlamim. What do you mean? They could also potentially be shlamim. So meaning, if I want to bring, now you have to understand some background. We'll get to all this when we learn Zivachim, but we're not there yet, and we have a while till we get there, so let me fill you in. If you take a sacrifice, we actually talked about it in Pesachim a little bit. If you take a sacrifice, that was an animal that was meant to be sacrificed as a shlamim offering, and you offer it as an ola, it's invalid. You can't do that kind of thing. You can't just switch it. So the Gemara says, I don't get this. How on earth could the Mishna say, if it was male, I can assume it was an ola. It could have been a shlamim, a peace offering, because okay, if it's female, it can't be an ola. But if it's male, it could be a shlamim. A shlamim doesn't have to be female. It could be female. It could be male. So remember the difference between ola and shlamim. Ola completely gets burnt. Shlamim is part of it is eaten, or a large part of it is eaten by the owners. So it's not all. It's called Shekalim. It's lighter level of sanctity because the owners do get to eat the meat, whereas ola is burnt entirely. It's called Shekalim. But either way, you can't bring something that was meant to be a shlamim as a korban ola. So it doesn't make any sense, this Mishna. To which Amar Rabbi Oshaya, he explains our Mishna as saying the following. Hacha bibat lachuv b'demeha maskina. What you really wanted to do is what I accidentally started saying from the beginning, which is you wanted to keep that animal for yourself. And what did you say? Well, I know this animal might be sanctified. So what am I going to do? I'm going to trade it in, okay, or pay its way. But you assume, again, it's a little bit of a doubt because you don't really know, but you assume this was used for a sacrifice. Okay, now, for what sacrifice can you assume? Well, if it's male, I'll assume it was an ola. And what am I going to do? I want to keep this animal for myself. I'll pay the value and bring a korban ola to replace this animal. Now you might say, wait a minute, isn't there a law of tmura? You can't switch animals, and if you switch the sanctity to something else, it doesn't work. Well, here it's a little bit different, because why? So actually, I'll go on one more line, and then I'll explain how the Pnei Yoshua understands this. By the way, there's a little bit of a debate about, or a big debate, how exactly to understand this. I'm going with Rashi's interpretation. V'hachi kamar. So now this is what it really meant to say. Chayshinan shema olot. You have to be concerned that maybe it's an ola. Meaning, okay, now, concern that maybe it's an ola is different than saying you assume it's an ola. So now what they really mean is, I find this animal, it's a male animal. It could be an ola, it could be a shlamim. Now, okay, right now we're going to assume it's one of two. Later the Gemara is going to ask, why can't it be more? But right now, let's assume it's one of two. If I think, right, I don't know what this animal is. Could be an ola, could be a shlamim, because an ola has to be male, and a shlamim could be male. So what do I have to do? I actually have to do something a bit crazy. If I want to keep this animal, I have to pay double for it. I have to pay money for a korban ola, in case it's an ola, and then I bring it and I say, listen, if that was an ola, this is in place of that. This is going to take the place of this animal. Hold off, we'll get to tomorrow how you could take place. But if it's an ola, this will be in place of that animal. If not, if the animal wasn't an ola, then, and it was a shlamim, then this will be in place of, right, then if it wasn't, then I'm bringing a voluntary ola offering, which you can always do. So basically your first condition is, if this animal was for a burnt offering, here I'm offering it as the burnt offering that it was. If not, right? Now I'm taking money in place of it, and I'm giving that money instead of it, and I'm bringing an olah offering. If not, the olah offering I'm bringing now is just a voluntary olah offering. And likewise, you say at the same time, if the original animal was a shlamim, then I'm bringing this korban shlamim in place of that. So I now have to take, let's say the animal costs $100. I have to take $200. I pay $100 for an olah in place of the animal, in case that's what it was. And I take $100 and I bring a shlamim offering, and I say the same thing. If the animal was a shlamim, this is for in place of it. And if not, then here's a voluntary shlamim offering, which I can do. So now, I've now paid double to get this animal. I obviously really like the animal, I wanted to keep it, so I'm willing to pay the double amount. And now we have the question, though, what happened to Tamura? Where did that go? You're not allowed to substitute a different animal. There are some cases where you can switch an animal. For example, if the animal's blemished. Now, this animal wasn't blemished yet, so that doesn't help us. But in this case, the Pnei Yoshua says, since we don't know if it's an olah and a shlamim, therefore we can't bring the animal as an olah or shlamim. Therefore, it's kind of like a blemished animal. It can't be brought on the altar at all, because maybe it's an olah and then I can't bring it as a shlamim. Maybe it's a shlamim, I can't bring it as an olah. So since I can't sacrifice it, then we allow me to instead bring a different animal. Okay? So that's what I do. This is all just so I could keep the animal. Now he's going to add one more thing, Rabbi Yoshua. Whose opinion does this follow? Because what's the idea here? I want to get this animal to be mine and use it for all sorts of things. This assumes that what? That I can intentionally take off the sanctity and turn it into chulin, right? Otherwise, what's the point of me having a sanctified animal that doesn't belong to me in my property? It doesn't help me at all if it's sanctified. So what he says is, Rabbi Meir, this Mishnah must hold by Rabbi Meir. Ta'amal hekdesh b'mezid mitchalel, because Rabbi Meir holds that hekdesh, intentionally, I can take off the sanctity. Now, it's a little bit different because me'ila is a sin when I'm not allowed to do it, and this is actually saying I'm allowed to do it. The Gemara will get back to that. But right now, let's just go with this connection. We have a case where intentionally you're turning something sanctified into something non-sanctified. You're paying its value, right? You're taking care of it, but you are turning it intentionally. According to Rabbi Yehuda, this wouldn't work. To which the Gemara is going to ask, but wait a minute. Because remember, Rabbi Yehuda said, b'mezi, there is no such thing. Me'ila is only b'shkaga, and therefore the chulin only happens when it's shkaga. Remember, we had that example where the people knew the money and they gave it to, right? He gave it to the shaliach gave it to the storekeeper, and only the storekeeper was chayav and me'ila. They all knew, right? And the sanctity didn't leave it when they passed it from one to the other. Right. And when he gave it to the storekeeper, there was no me'ila there because he knew at that point that it was hekdesh. And when you know, it doesn't leave the sanctity doesn't leave it. So now the Gemara says, until now, our whole discussion has been about money, things like that. Okay. I had food that was sanctified, something like that. But animals that are supposed to be brought as sacrifices are different. In general, there's two types of sanctities. There's kedushat haguf, and this kedushat damim. Kedushat damim means the value. If I say my table is dedicated to the temple, I don't really mean my table. I mean, I'm going to bring the value of my table to the temple. Okay? But if I say I'm bringing this animal for a sacrifice, that's kedushat haguf. Now that's always a higher level because this is actually going to be brought on the altar, and the item itself is going to the temple. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. It might be true that according to Rabbi Meir, you can change sanctity. You can take sanctity off of something and put it, right, make it chulin by putting it onto something else. Okay. Or if you did me'ila intentionally, right? But you can, both those cases are cases where we're intentionally removing the sanctity. But if something is kedushat haguf, like an animal, which is kind of the basis of tamura, the whole concept, you can't just remove the sanctity from it. And how do we know this? We're going to bring a Mishnah that contradicts. Hadran. Now again, we can't exactly compare it to tamura because in this case, you can't bring the animal on the altar. So you're going to have to find a way to, fix it, let's say in some other way. But still, they don't think the kedushat haguf could just come off by intending it, by taking the money and replacing it. Why not? It says in the following Mishnah, and this is the Mishnah in Me'ila, which is all our topic about misusing consecrated property. Ein mo'el achar mo'el b'mukdashim, ela b'behema u'b'klei sharet bilvad. Okay, this has two parts to it. Let's start with the first part of the sentence. There's no mo'el after mo'el by mukdashim. That means if I have something sanctified and I buy something with it, and then you take it, let's say, or you steal it. Okay, it's one of the examples they bring here. I steal someone's sanctified property, and then someone steals it from me, and then someone steals it from that person. Okay, the only person that's liable for me'ila is me, because I'm the first one who stole it. So I stole it, misused it by stealing it, taking it for myself. And at that point, it's chulin. And therefore, anyone who stole it from me after, they're not doing any, there is no me'ila after me'ila. We've seen this concept in bishul achar bishul. Once you cook something, it's cooked. So there's no such thing. If you warm it up, it's not considered cooking anymore, right? So this also, same idea. But there is me'ila after me'ila, b'behema u'b'klei sharet bilvad. But in animals or sanctified vessels, okay, like if I use a sanctified vessel for something, and then you steal it and use it for something else, and then someone else steals it, that will, because the sanctified vessel from the temple is a kli sharet, it itself is sanctified. And likewise, the animal for the sacrifice is sanctified. Therefore, there is me'ila. Me'ila will continue with every subsequent person who uses it, because every time they use it, they're using something sanctified. And right, they're using it for a non-sacred purpose. And that is, they're liable for me'ila. So now this is based on two things, okay? Now, first of all, you have to assume that they're talking about classic me'ila here. So they're talking about shkaga. So the first thing that the Mishna is saying is me'ila in shkaga, in a general case, when you say ein mo'el achar mo'el b'mukdashim, that means anything sanctified that someone accidentally used is going to turn to chulin. And then we're going to say, but not if it's kedushat haguf. Now, line 2 is the problem. Because what does it say? If something's sanctified kedushat haguf, right, it doesn't become unsanctified when you use it. So that seems to go against Rabbi Meir, who says you can take this animal that you found that was meant for a sacrifice and use it for whatever you, right? You can, as long as you pay the money, it's fine, even though it was kedushat haguf. So now they're going to explain, by the way, I already kind of explained it, but they're going to explain it inside the Mishnah. How does this whole thing work, this Mishnah? Ketzad, he'arochev al gabei behema, b'chavero v'rachav, b'chavero v'rachav, kulam ma'alu. You were riding on an animal that was sanctified to the temple, supposed to be brought to sacrifice, and then you rode on it, then your friend rode on it, then another friend rode on it. Everyone's liable because nobody turned it into chulin. Or with the kli sharet, hayas shoteh b'kos shel zahav, you were drinking from a golden vessel from the temple, and then b'chavero v'shata, kulam ma'alu. Then subsequently, a bunch of people drank from that same cup. Everyone is liable because the sanctity never left, because kedushat haguf sanctity doesn't leave. To which the Gemara says, and you might have picked up on this since I mentioned before, that the Mishnah is based on two things. One is, if it was accidental, it would be mitchalel, right? It would become chulin. Well, remember, Rabbi Meir doesn't think that's the case, right? Unless you destroyed it. But if you didn't destroy it, then it doesn't become chulin. So they answer, don't question. Remember, Rabbi Oshaya explained the Mishna in Shekalim according to Rabbi Meir, that intentionally you can remove sanctity. But this Mishna doesn't contradict, because who Rabbi Yehuda? This is Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Meir in the previous Mishna from Shekalim was Rabbi Meir. Okay, the case where you could take the animal and redeem it into money, but with money and pay the ola, pay the shlamim. Well, that's Rabbi Meir. This Mishnah, where you see it's Rabbi Yehuda, because the first part was, if there's me'ila, accidental, right? We assume it meant it was unwitting. Well, then it removes the sanctity. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir doesn't agree with that. And then it said, well, unless it's kedushat haguf. Well, that's Rabbi Yehuda, because the first part's Rabbi Yehuda, the whole thing's Rabbi Yehuda, in which case it's not a question of Rabbi Meir, who's to say Rabbi Meir thinks that kedushat haguf is any different. But now the Gemara says, of course, Rabbi Meir would think kedushat haguf is different, just like Rabbi Yehuda. There's no reason to think that they disagree about that point, because now they're going to say, Mida Rabbi Yehuda, Nishma Rabbi Meir, from Rabbi Yehuda, when he holds about his thing, we can learn to what Rabbi Meir holds about his opinion. What does this mean? Let's read inside. Lav amar Rabbi Yehuda. Now remember, they both think that there's a case where hekdesh turns to chulin. It's just they disagree about which case. Rabbi Yehuda thinks it's accidental, unwitting, becomes chulin, and Rabbi Meir thinks it's mezi, intentional. So now they say the following. If hekdesh, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, hekdesh b'shogeg mitchalel, he said, right? If it's shkaga, it becomes chulin. Ukdushat haguf lo mitachala. But kedushat haguf, it doesn't apply to kedushat haguf. In other words, yes, you could turn something sanctified into non-sanctified by doing me'ilah if you did it unwittingly, but not in a case of kedushat haguf. The sanctity isn't removed if it's kedushat haguf. You will be liable to korban, but the sanctity is not removed. Le Rabbi Meir nami. Well, then let's take that and apply to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir will agree. This is always the idea that they don't disagree completely and entirely about every single thing. Rabbi Meir, who says, but Rabbi Meir says, in the case where he thinks hekdesh can turn to chulin, which is mezid, when it intentionally becomes chulin, but he'll agree with Rabbi Yehuda that not if it's kedushat haguf. There's no reason to think that they disagree about that point. They each think there's one situation where it happens. One says shogeg, one says mezid, right? Unintentional, intentional. But to what that applies, what the range of items that can be turned into chulin, theoretically should be the same. There's no reason to think they would disagree about that, which means that we go back to question Rabbi Meir. How can you intentionally remove sanctity from an animal that was kadosh kedushat haguf? To which they answer, Hatam lo kamachaven la'afukinu lechulin. Hacha kamachaven la'afukinu lechulin. Now we go back to the whole theory of Rabbi Meir, and we say the following. In Rabbi Yehuda's case, where he said, right, this Mishna, which we assume is Rabbi Yehuda, that but in animals, there is Megillah after Megillah, and it doesn't become sanctified. That's because it was all, if you did it accidentally, remember, the whole Mishna is a case of accidental. You didn't know, and you drank from a kli sharet, or you rode on an animal that you didn't know was being used for a sacrifice. And then your friend rode on it, and then your other friend rode on it. Well, the sanctity remains. Why? Well, because you didn't intend anything. And number one, it wasn't shkaga, it was shkaga, which usually should remove the sanctity, but it's got a higher amount of sanctity to it because it's kedushat haguf. That is harder to remove. Me'ilah doesn't remove that if it's accidental because you didn't intend anything. But when it comes to Rabbi Meir's opinion, his opinion is only when you do it intentionally does it remove the sanctity. Why are you going to say that you can't remove sanctity from an animal if you intentionally treat it as chulin? The whole reason why shagaga and why Rabbi Yehuda says kedushat haguf, it doesn't remove its sanctity is because the sanctity is so great, and you're making a mistake about it is not strong enough to do it. In kedushat damim, when its value is sanctified, yes, that's how me'ilah. That's the standard case of me'ilah, and then it works. Then it actually turns to chulin, but not if it was accidental and it was such a high level of kedusha that it was inherent sanctity. That doesn't come off through me'ilah. But if I intentionally, according to Rabbi Meir, the whole idea is I want to remove the sanctity. Well, if you want to remove the sanctity and you intend to, you can even get it off a kedushat haguf item, okay, whether it be an animal or a kli sharet or whatever it might be. Kli sharet are the vessels that were specifically used in the temple. So now we've resolved that question, okay? Now we basically are almost done with this section, which is the Mishna in Shekalim, where Rabbi Meir says you can intentionally remove the sanctity by paying the value of the sacrifices to the temple. That's Rabbi Meir. It doesn't contradict this Mishna, right? You can't use this Mishna in Me'ilah to contradict because that Mishna is Rabbi Yehuda, and it's Rabbi Yehuda all the way. Don't think that kedushat haguf is different from Rabbi Meir because Rabbi Meir's is all about intent, and intentionally you can't actually remove sanctity. Now they're going to say, but wait a minute. Until now, we've been talking about high-level sanctity. What are things that are high-level sanctity? Okay, now we distinguish, I want to make clear. There's kedushat damim and kedushat haguf. There's things that are their value is sanctified and their body, the goof of it is sanctified. And there's also kochim and kochim kalim. What's the difference? Kachim kalim. I actually brought it up earlier to show you with the korban, the sacrifice. In Ola gets all burnt to God. So that's completely sanctified. A shlamim is only partially sanctified because some of it will get burnt on the altar, but some of it will be eaten by us. So we can eat it. That means it's obviously not high-level sanctity. Now, if it's not high-level sanctity, well, then Be'ila doesn't apply as much in those cases because the Be'ila is much weaker because it's part of it is anyway allowed for me to benefit from, kind of like we talked about yesterday with the big day kuna, where once there's a way they can benefit from them, it's already much weaker, right? And then Be'ila is not as strong here. It's not as big a deal. So what they say is the following. Other things, by the way, that are kochim are things that I buy for the temple itself, like tables to be used in the temple and other things like that. It's called bedek habayit, or things to fix up in the temple. Those are completely and utterly sanctified because they're completely used for the temple and can't be used for anybody else's use. So now we say, well, if I'm going to intentionally take the sanctity off of something and turn something that was fully sanctified into chol by using it and benefiting from it, it makes sense that would happen in kochim, like the ola. Okay, so for example, the ola part of it, I see if it's an ola, I can definitely remove the sanctity because that's complete sanctity. I can't get any benefit. As soon as I try to benefit from it, I immediately remove the sanctity from it. But in kochim kalim, where anyway I can benefit from it. So maybe when I go to use it and take this animal for myself, maybe I'm not actually able to remove the sanctity entirely because some of it was already for my benefit. So who's to say that I can actually remove all the sanctity from it by using it? So that's their question. How do we know this applies in Shekalim? In which case, how could I possibly, if it was a shlamim, I wouldn't be able to remove the sanctity? To which they say, now it's actually counterintuitive to a certain extent because you would think it's harder to remove sanctity from something that's higher level Kiddushin. And in the end, that's really what they're going to say. But I want you to understand the logic at this point, which is, well, since it's partially given to people to benefit from, then since they can actually benefit them by my using it, I haven't done something as terrible, which means I haven't really removed the sanctity. As soon as I do something terrible, right, then I really remove the sanctity. So now they say the following, and that's what I said. The logic really could say the opposite, which is Amalei Humei Rabbanan. This rabbi said, Rabbi Yaakov Shmei, Kal v'chomer. It's a simple Kal v'chomer argument. If I can basically remove the sanctity of something higher level sanctity, obviously I can remove it from something that's lower level sanctity like kochim kalim. And not only did he say this, but he was also said, Amar Rabbi Chama Rabbi Akiva, Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, Omer Haya Rabbi Meir, hekdesh b'mezeh mitchalel b'shogeg em mitchalel. So now they quote different people saying in the name of Rabbi Meir that hekdesh, when you do it intentionally, it becomes chulin. B'shogeg, not only when it's intentional. That's a repeat of what we've seen. But now it says echad kochim, echad kochim kalim, and right, whether it's the higher level, whether it's the lower level, which then explains how we can understand this Mishna, according to Rabbi Meir, that you could remove the sanctity either if it was an ola or if it was a shlamim, either which way. Remember, we don't know which one, so we have to assume it's one or the other, and therefore we can remove the sanctity. And again, the same person who quoted it, not whoever quoted it from the name of Rabbi Meir, also added this kavachomel. Again, learned by a simple kavachomer argument. If you can remove the sanctity of something stronger sanctity, obviously you can remove the sanctity of something lower. Okay, now we basically understood this Mishnah with a few little things that we haven't yet fully understood. But let's review what we have understood. We have this animal. I find it on the street. It could be a shlamim, it could be an ola. Again, why not other things? We'll get to that. I can intentionally come along and say, I'm going to give double its value. I'll give the value of this animal as a possible ola offering, the value of this animal as possible shlamim offering in order to free the sanctity from this animal. Then I can use the animal and do whatever I want with it. How does this work? Well, because just like Rabbi Meir says in Me'ila, with intentionality, I can remove sanctity from something and make it non-sacred. Likewise, if I pay the value of it to the temple, I can remove the sanctity from it. And in this case, I have to pay double the value because we're not really sure what it was intended to be. And that all fits with Rabbi Meir, and we're not worried about Kedushat HaGuf because he even thinks in Kedushat HaGuf it works, and we're not worried about Kochim Kalim because he even thinks Kochim Kalim it could work. Okay, and that's Kavachomer from Kochim Kochim. That was our whole review of what we did till now. Now we have this big question, which is Taiba Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, starting at the top of Amud Bet now. But wait a minute. Removing sanctity from something and using a sanctified item is me'ila. How can we intentionally tell a person, go do something wrong, and then you can benefit from it? How do we intentionally tell this person, oh yeah, you want this animal? Sure. Just pay the value and then take the animal. Till now, the whole me'ila is based on sinning. We don't recommend you do this. If you did it, well, then you actually remove the sanctity, but we don't tell you should go ahead and do this. So Ella Amar Rabbi Yochanan understands this differently. He says, Mamtin la adja tumam. You have to wait till the animal actually gets blemished. Only once it's blemished. And no, an animal that was designated for a sacrifice, depending on what sacrifice, but let's say an ola or shlamim, you can actually redeem with money if it gets blemished, because once it's blemished, it can be no longer brought on the altar. So once it's blemished and it's no longer an animal that could be actually brought on the altar, then you'll be allowed to do this. But until then, you really can't. You have to just keep the animal until it gets a blemish, and then you can redeem it. Okay? And pay, again, and then you have to bring 2 animals in its stead. If you really want to do this, you're going to have to pay double for the value of this one animal, right? You obviously must have really liked this animal to want to do this. Number one, now not only do you have to bring 2 animals in its stead, you also have to wait until it gets blemished. And that seems to be the only way you could do it. Otherwise, it seems there's no way that you could intentionally remove sanctity when removing sanctity from something that's sanctified is actually forbidden. Okay, that's that. Now we're going to go back to the line, Amar Mal, Scharim Olot. Now we're going to say, why do we assume if it's male, it's an Ola? Dilma Todahi. Wait, there's other sacrifices as well. It could be a type of shlamim offering that's called a korban toda, a thanksgiving offering, to which they say, okay, so demaite nami toda. Now we're going to learn you have to do it times 3, and not only times 3 in a minute, we'll see even more than that. But right now we're going to say, yeah, it could have been a male, could have been an Ola, it could have been a shlamim, and it could have been a unique shlamim called a thanksgiving offering. To which they say, wait, you're going to have to bring 3 animals, but that's not enough. If you bring a korban toda, then habaya lechem, it has to come with these 40 loaves of bread. So you're going to have to bring the animal. I don't see that it said anywhere you have to bring the bread. Tamaite nami lechem. I said, oh no, what it means is you bring the bread along with it. Now, Thanksgiving offering is a voluntary offering. So basically, we're going to do the same thing. They say, if it was an ola, then this is an ola, and then the shlamim, right? Then I'm going to bring 2 other animals, shlamim and a toda, and those are going to be voluntary. If this animal was a shlamim, then my ola and my toda are voluntary offerings. And if the animal is for a toda offering, a Thanksgiving offering, then the other 2, the shlamim and the ola, will be voluntary offerings. And in the end, you now have to pay 3 times the price. So we keep upping it, 3 times the price, and bring loaves of these 40 loaves of bread that go along with the Thanksgiving offering, because otherwise it's not a valid Thanksgiving offering. But the possibilities are endless. V'dilma ashamhu. But maybe it's a guilt offering. Now, a guilt offering cannot be brought with this condition that we've been making, because a guilt offering can only be brought if you're liable. A guilt offering, there's no such thing as a voluntary guilt offering. You can't bring it if it's voluntary. So they say, okay, well, asham ben shtei shanim v'ishtekach ben shana. Now we're going to live at the case. We're going to say, well, since if it's a male and it's 2 years, okay, you're supposed to bring a keves, an ayil. You're supposed to bring an ayil. An ayil is a keves that's 2 years old, okay? It's a sheep that's 2 years old. So now, if you find a 2-year-old animal, you actually can't take it. Because if it's in its 2nd year, it could be it was an asham, and then there's nothing you could do with it. So you can't take it and make it your own, because there's no way to remove the sanctity. So we're now narrowing this case that if it was a male, it would have to be within its 1st year. To which the Gemara says, Dilma Asham Mitzorahu or Asham Nazirhu. But an Asham Mitzorah or an Asham Nazir is actually a keves, which is in its 1st year. So it could be one of those, and those aren't brought as voluntary offerings, to which they answer that chances of it being the Asham of a leper or the Asham of a Nazir is very rare. And therefore, lo shriche, and therefore we're not worried. So if I find a 1-year-old within its 1st year, it should be under a year, animal that was a male animal, I can assume was either an ola, a shlamim, or a toda. I don't have to worry about the outside possibility that maybe it was an asham of a mitzorah or a nasi. B'dilma pesachu, but wait, a pesach is brought with a lamb, right? These are all lamb, sheep family, okay? So the pesach was brought with a lamb that was within its first year. Maybe it was a korban pesach. To which they answered, unlikely. Why? First of all, pesach bizmano mizhar zehiriba. When you have a korban pesach and it's the time to bring it, then people are very careful about their korban pesachs. Just like we take all sorts of laws of pesach very seriously, they took their sacrifice very seriously. You're not going to just find a random one wandering around, or the chances are very unlikely. Vishalo bizmano, and you might remember this from Sachim, if you have an animal that was designated for a pesach, and then let's say they couldn't find the animal, and now it's left over and it's past Pesach, well, you can't save it for next year because it has to be within its first year and it won't be next year. So you bring it as a regular korban shlamim, and shlamim we've already got covered here. So this doesn't add anything new. Vidilma bechor umaser ninhu. Maybe it's an animal that was the firstborn that's supposed to go to the Kohen and the Kohen sacrifices it, or the maser behema, the 10th animal, which also goes to the Kohen. Kohen has to sacrifice it. Well, they say lamai hilchata. What would be the relevance if it was bechor or maser? Because also they're brought as sacrifices. Lemichlinu bimuman. Achinami bimuman mitachle. Well, anyway, those are eaten only when they get those. You can actually, if they get blemished, you can actually eat them. So we already said that anyway, these have to be blemished. So it also doesn't add anything. Okay, so that dealt with our male and all the possible other possibilities of what it could be. And in the end, we end up with, you have actually in the end have to bring 3 animals in its stead: an ola, a shlamim, right, a burnt, a peace offering, and the Thanksgiving offering. And you have to bring the breads that go with the Thanksgiving offering. And it's only if it's within its first year, because within its second year, you have to worry that maybe it was a korban hasham, and that can't be brought as a possible volunteer offering. Amar. Now we go back to the nikevot, the females. Nikevot zivchei shlamim, to which they say, dilma todahi. Female could also be used for a Thanksgiving offering. To which they answer, demaite todah. So now we learn, if it's a female, you actually have to bring it a shlamim, and you have to bring a Thanksgiving offering. And again, vahabin on lechem, it doesn't need bread. Demaite nami lechem. Well, you'd have to bring it with the bread. Now, dilma chatati. Now, a chatat can be brought as from a female. So, right, and as chatats are brought from female animals, a sin offering. As opposed to the guilt offering, which is male, the sin offering is a female animal. And I say maybe it's a chatat. This is going to be the reverse. When you find a female, it can be within its first year, because if it's within its first year, it's possible it was a sin offering. And again, a sin offering can't be brought voluntary. It's just like a guilt offering in that sense. So it must be only a female animal that you find that's in its second year of life, not in its first year. And then you'd be able to do this. To which they say, "V'dilma chatacha avrashnata." But wait, maybe it was an animal that was within its first year. Someone designated as a sin offering, but then it passed its first year before it was actually brought. And that's one of the 5 cases of a chatat that we leave the animal to die. There's nothing you can do about it. It can't be redeemed at all. So the fact that we found this female animal that's in its second year could possibly be a sin offering, an animal that was designated for sin offering and then got too old and couldn't be brought. And because of that, it, and then it ran away. To which they say, lo shachiach. It's not common that you'd have this animal, that this would happen. And even if it would happen, it's not common that it would be wandering around and get to you. Chances are very slim. We're not worried about this possibility. So then they say, ishtakach bat shnatamai. So what if you find it within its first year? Then what do? Tanya Hananya ben Chachinai omer ez bat shnata lechatat. So then they say, in ez, this, right, that's a goat within its first year. We'll go to a sin offering. So if you find a goat that's within its first year, you bring it as a sin offering. Gemara says, what? No way, no how. You can't possibly bring it as a chatat. We just said, you don't know if it's a chatat. It could have been a burnt offering. Could have been it could have been not a burnt. Burnt is only male. Could have been a shlamim or a toda. So how could you possibly bring it? We can't voluntarily bring a chatat. Ela amrabai ki chatat. No. You have to treat it like a chatat. Which is what? This is what I said before, which is, right? And if now, this is it's a different case, but it's a chatat that we don't know now who it belongs to. If it was designated as a chatat, right? We don't know. It could be, it was a shlamim. Could be it was a toda. But since there's a possibility, if we find this animal within its first year, there's a strong possibility or a possibility that it was a sin offering, and the sin offering like that has to be left to die. So what does it mean? If you find a goat within its first year, you have to treat it like you would that if it were a chatat, which means you have to close it in this pen, leave it there, and let it die, right? This is for people who feel strongly. We should all feel this way about animal rights. This is a very difficult sugya, this concept that we just leave the animal to die. But that's what they do, because this was considered a very high level sanctity that you have no way out of it. And therefore, there's nothing to do but to let the animal die. So basically what we've seen is that some Mishnah that seemed somewhat simple to begin with, this Mishna in Shekalim, about you find this animal outside Jerusalem. If it's male, you assume it's an ola. If it's female, you assume it's a shlamim. It doesn't mean what we thought it meant, which is bring it as a ola, bring it as a shlamim. In the end, we took Rabbi Oshaya, who said, well, it's really according to Rabbi Meir, and what it means is you can remove the sanctity and then just bring 2 animals in its stead, which eventually we meant actually 3 animals. Maybe it's an ola, maybe it's a shlamim, maybe it's a toda, and you have to bring the breads with it. And if it's female, maybe it's a shlamim, maybe it's a toda. And then the asham, right? We're not worried it's an asham because you could only do it if it's a male within its first year. And we're not worried about a chatat because it's only a female in its second year. And we don't have to worry about chatat shavrash nata because that's rare. We don't have to worry about the asham matzorah and the asham nazir, which could be in its first year because that's rare. And, and so on and so on. And if we end up finding a female within its first year, we actually have to let it die. We cannot take it at all and can't remove the sanctity in any way. We have to be concerned that maybe it was a chatat, and there's nothing to do about that. With that, we finish our daf. Wishing everybody a Chag Sameach. Maybe not the most connected daf to the holiday of Shmini Atzeret / Simchat Torah, which is in Israel. But anyway, that was our daf. We learned a lot about Me'ilah, which will help us when we get to Me'ilah in a few years from now. Hopefully you'll remember some of these things. And with that, wishing everybody a Chag Sameach and a Shabbat Shalom.